Pride of the Marchers. I know for a fact that this is the very shield the Marcher General, Tommy Drakes, took with him into the battle with the tyrant boyar of Varushka, lied Allisto with an absolutely sincere expression on his face. The Marchers seemed interested and asked several follow-up questions. The Carter had anticipated most of them, but there were a few that came from unexpected directions and he had to improvise quickly and seamlessly. He was in his element, carefully playing on the Marcher's genuine, heartfelt desire for what he was saying to be true. The third person, though, they made Allisto nervous. They hadn't spoken since they entered the antique shop Allisto and his compatriots had created using a lot of small trinkets, brass and red leather. They simply stood a pace or so back from their companions and watched what was happening. They were mostly hidden from sight in their pastel green robes, hands shrouded deep inside their sleeves, their face lost in a voluminous hood. He assumed they were Urizeni, probably. Every time he glanced back at them, he felt a prickling sensation at the back of his neck that his grandmother always called the scoundrel's nip, and any mountebank knew they were foolish to ignore. Time to wrap it up, he thought. He touched his ear, seemingly casually, but in fact as a signal to Barto on the other side of the shop that they were going in for the kill. He finally brought out the age-old document of Providence. He was very pleased with the effect. The paper, the ink, and even the wax used for the seal were each a century or more old. Obviously, the actual text had been written less than a fortnight ago, after they'd heard the Declaration of Conclave. Jasern had a lot of practice faking things like this, and he doubted old Leontes himself would be able to tell it from the real thing. Not while examining it in the dim light of a shadowy antique shop, at any rate. The Marchers were nodding, and one of them casually asked their companion what they thought. "Let me see it." This was the first time they'd spoken since entering, and they stepped forward as they did so, holding out one hand towards the mountebank. In his hand was a lambent orb of translucent green glass. Allisto froze, convinced the orb was watching him. Holding his fingers steady by the effort of will, he presented the document. "No," said the figure. "Not the paper, the shield." He could see Barto was making the fuck it and run gesture, but Allisto soldiered on. He was so close to sealing the deal, and they stood to make so much money if this came off. He held the shield out. As you can see, the years have not been kind to it, but I assure you, it is the very shield that turned aside the blows of the monster they called the Butcher of Bulgakov. He extemporized wildly. The figure passed the orb over the battered shield, which was an actual Marcher's shield, but it had in fact been recovered from a battlefield outside of Holberg. It paused, passed it back, paused. Then the orb disappeared back inside the capricious sleeve. The figure reached out and tapped the shield hard with one long finger. Allisto was lifted off the ground and hurled backwards through the glass case of artifacts behind the desk. He smacked into the wall with enough force to drive the breath from his body. "This is a lie. It is not what we're looking for," said the third figure calmly, and without another word turned and walked out of the shop by the door through which Barto had already bolted. Their actions left the Marchers shocked, realization slowly dawning on them. Looking back and forth between the departing entity, the mountebank, and the broken glass, frowns started to spread across their faces. "Uh-oh," said Allisto, to no one in particular. Overview. The Imperial Conclave has asked Chimus to track down the Vorpal sword of Tom Drake. Last summit, the Imperial Conclave accepted a boon of finding from the Eternal Chimus. Raywin Farkas, on behalf of the Silver Chalice, directed them to seek out the Vorpal sword of Tom Drake, the first general of the Marcher army and one of the founders of Imperial Military Council. The Heralds of the Thousand Eyes have completed their search, and informed the Empire where the relic, the weapon that struck down the tyrant boyar, Alderai the Fair, is to be found. Pride in small things, loyalty to great things. The Heralds of Chimus have found the Vorpal sword of Tom Drake. Tom Drake is a complex figure, the general of the Marchers who is credited with winning the Cousins' War for the nascent empire, uniting the fractious Marchers as the nation it is today, being the first general of the Drake's army, leading the war against Alderai the Fair, and shaping the formation of the Imperial Military Council. An impressive legacy. He was known to be a master of several weapons, favouring both the sword and the bill. In his final confrontation with the tyrant boyar Alderai, the battle that cost him his life, He wielded a vorpal sword crafted for him by his wife Amanda. While he ultimately died, he killed the Varushkan general before the wounds claimed his life. He was returned to his beloved Redstone and was buried beneath the apple trees of Tom's orchard beside generations of ancestors and descendants. The Eyes of Chimus were sent out to find that sword, wielded in that final battle, and ultimately slew Alderai the Fair. It takes them surprisingly little time to locate it. It has been nearly 4 centuries, but the line of Tom Drake still lives in Redstone, on the very same farmland that the general worked. William Drake is a respected yeoman, a participant in the political pageantry of Anvil during the time of Empress Britta, now retired. Tom Drake's vorpal sword now hangs above the fireplace in his front room. The Blade of Tom Drake. The sword has been located in Upwold. It belongs to William Drake, a descendant of Tom Drake. The sword is an heirloom of Drake's descendants, passed down from parent to child through the long centuries since his death. It is without a doubt the legal property of William Drake, and his to do with as he wishes. He seems surprised at the interest in the weapon. "It's a sturdy enough blade," he says, "but you can buy its like in any market in the Empire near enough." The weapon is not an artifact. It has had its potency restored a handful of times since Drake's death, usually by family members. It was last wielded in the battle in 349 YE during the final fight against the Jotun in the Mournwald. When the territory was lost, William's mother hung it up and it has not been taken down since. William does concede that it's not just an old family relic. "Anyone who holds it knows their duty," he says grudgingly. "They remember what matters and what they have to do about it." He is, however, not interested in a trail of people tramping through his front room, wanting to prod and poke at the family heirloom. He makes it clear that anyone who tries to trespass on his time or that of his family will be given a short shrift. Be they Archmage or Empress, they best remember that every yeoman is the master in his own fields. A civil tongue. William Drake is prepared to give it to the General of the Drakes in return for certain concessions. He wants Tom Drake recognised as an exemplar of pride. He also wants the Senate to reinstate Drake's due, and recommission the drummers as part of the Marcher armies. William Drake is not a fool, however. He knows that the Imperial Conclave would not have sent Chimus's agents to find his ancestor's sword without a vested interest in recovering it. He's prepared to bend a little, if the Empire wants it, but not the Conclave. William Drake does not trust the Conclave. What he does trust is the Marchers, and the Imperial Military Council that his many times great-grandfather helped to create. He wants 2 things before he's prepared to surrender the heirloom blade. He wants the Imperial Synod to recognise his ancestor as an exemplar of pride, and he wants the Imperial Senate to reinstate a group called the Drake's Drummers. Drake's legacy. William Drake wants his ancestor recognised as an exemplar of pride. Tom Drake was never ashamed a day in his life, and he knew well that words and deeds alone are never enough. He is somewhat sceptical that the Imperial Synod is sensible enough to see the merit in this, however. So to encourage them, he asks that the Imperial Senate, the Minister of Historical Research, or the Leopardeian Librarian commission historical research into the life and history of Tom Drake. Once that's done, he is confident that the Assembly of Pride will do the right thing. Drake's Drummers. The drummers were a tradition within the Marcher armies that started with the Drakes. They were veteran soldiers who actively gathered support for the Drakes, and eventually other Marcher armies at every opportunity. Recognisable by the traditional drums they used, and by the tattoo of the army sigil that they generally wore on their forearms, they represented a solemn calling. Their duties were threefold. Firstly, they recruited new soldiers from the youth of the Marchers, regularly attending fairs and market days to beat the drums and proletise about the benefits of joining the army. They often organised contests of physical prowess or cunning, with small prizes for the winners, who were also the main targets of their recruitment pitches. The Drakes want the best, after all. The problem was that these practices continued even when the Drakes were billeted in foreign nations, and were occasionally a source of friction for the Marchers. The Constitution guarantees that anyone who serves 2 years as part of an imperial army will receive 50 acres of land or equivalent wealth or property at the end of their service. While sounding out those they thought would make good additions to the marches, the drummers often found a receptive ear among disaffected youth. And they were good at it. Almost everyone recruited by a drummer went on to become a marcher citizen. That always didn't sit well with well-to-do folk in other nations. The Navarre might help those already searching for another place in the empire. The drummers were accused of poaching the best and brightest with promises of a better life in the army and afterwards. With the army itself, they were seen as exemplar of solid marcher virtue. No matter how far from home the soldiers of the Drakes travelled, the drummers made sure that they remembered where they came from. Traditionally, every drummer carried a sack of marcher soil and a pouch of seeds with them. Wherever the Drakes fought, they made a point of using that earth to plant some of those seeds, creating a corner of every battlefield where marcher soldiers have shed blood that is in some way part of the marches. Not everyone approved of the drummers. They were not shy about using their drums to ensure their service was for the good of the marchers. They would soon let their general know if they thought the army was off on campaign when it should be at home fighting threats to the marchers. And if that didn't work, they were adept at turning a bit of rough music into a larger heap of trouble for those that directed the Empire's wars. A lot of folks in military council were not sorry to see the back of the drummers when they fell out of favour. All of this sounds good to the marchers, but the other nations disagreed. In particular, the drummers received a special stipend from the Senate to help fund their activities. Small as it was, that stipend was easy for their critics to paint as a frivolous expenditure. And so in the reign of Empress Marika, it was abrogated. The drummers continued to do their best for the next few decades, but in the face of opposition and criticism, they eventually hung up their drums. The marchers are less proud for their lack, says William. The drummers are not a new marcher archetype. They are the equivalent of the jackals mentioned in the Red Wind Corsairs, a character hook you could use when making a martial marcher character. Drake's Due. Reinstating the drummers requires reinstating Drake's Due, increasing the upkeep of the Drakes by 5 thrones each season. The current custodian of the sword wants the drummers, and what he calls the Drake's Due, reinstated. This would require a Senate motion, and would permanently increase the cost to support the Drakes by 5 thrones each season. If this were done, the drummers would be reinstated. This would permanently change the quality of the Drakes to Pride of the Marchers. Inspired and supported by the drummers, it would mean that the billet order would be available across the marchers, rather than just in Mitwold and Upwold. The drummers were always keen on encouraging their fellow marchers to support soldiers, whether of their own nation or any other, knowing the benefits of allies. Pride of the Marchers. The army can take the drum-up support action while defending. This army can benefit from emergency resupply, regardless of what territory they're in, or whether they're engaged by the enemy. This army can benefit from natural resupply regardless of what territory they're in, even if they're taking the attacking order, so long as they're not engaged by the enemy. Other descriptors: quartermasters, superior logistics. The Drakes are beloved across the marchers, seen as exemplars of the nation's pride and loyalty. They have expert logistical support, able to quickly distribute resources and assign new soldiers, even when under attack. The marchers who join the army are doggedly committed to their cause, so that soldiers who are so badly hurt they would normally be decommissioned fight to be allowed to rejoin their units. Young folk from across the marchers want to join the Drakes, and with the aid of the drummers, they are given every opportunity to do so. Indeed, even while resting in other nations, the Drakes attract young people who want to fight in Tom Drake's army and ultimately become marchers themselves. Regalia. William Drake wants the sword to go to the general of the Drakes as part of their regalia. Regardless of what happens, William is only prepared to pass the sword to the general of the Drakes. Specifically, he will only hand it over if the Senate, or the new benefactor of the regalia, make it part of the general's regalia. The only other folk who have any right to call themselves Tom Drake's heirs, he says, are the soldiers of the army he loved near as much as his family. This could be done as part of the same motion that reinstated Drake's Due, given it is dependent on that decision. It would, however, only take effect once historical research regarding Tom Drake has been published, or the Synod had declared the Marcher General an exemplar of pride. Until then, William Drake will not part with the sword.